Every filmmaker who has adapted 1984 has made the same mistake. The warning Orwell actually wrote has never made it to screen. The most visible proof of this is a 60-second commercial. Apple aired it nationally only during the Super Bowl. Ridley Scott directed it. The image of a sledgehammer shattering a screen showing Big Brother became the dominant cultural reference point for what 1984 looks like, for everyone who had never picked up the book, and for most of the people who did. Orwell's central concern lives inside the language his characters use, and 70 years of adaptation have consistently addressed a different problem. The novel is an investigation of linguistic engineering at a population scale, with the architecture of thought as the target, and the words available to its citizens as the lever. The screen tradition that grew up around the book has stayed close to the surveillance apparatus, leaving the engineering project undisturbed on the page. The gap between what Orwell wrote and what audiences have absorbed through adaptations is the reason the warning has gotten more relevant every decade, and harder to recognize at the same time. The next 20 minutes are about why Orwell wrote a novel about Newspeak, why the screen versions have consistently delivered a version about telescreens, and why the difference between those two warnings has only become more legible as the years since the book's publication have stretched out. Let's set the stage. There have been two adaptations of 1984 of note, and the pattern starts to make sense the moment you line them up next to each other. The first arrived in 1956, directed by Michael Anderson, who would later make Logan's Run. Edmund O'Brien plays Winston. The film was made under heavy studio pressure to soften the ending, and the international release received an alternate cut in which Winston dies in defiance. The visual style ran towards sci-fi gothic, with high collars, geometric set design, and propaganda banners. The Ministry of Truth appeared as a brutalist office building. The story compressed the romance, expanded the police state visuals, and treated Newspeak as one cultural detail in the production design. The engine of the regime got handled as flavor. The second and most lasting adaptation came out in 1984, released by design in the year the book described. Michael Radford directed. John Hurt played Winston. Richard Burton played O'Brien in what would be his final screen performance. The film is visually extraordinary. The color palette runs between gray and bone and rust. The Hate Week sequences capture the choreographed mass psychology Orwell described, as well as any film has ever captured a mass political event. The torture sequences are unbearable in the specific way Orwell intended them to be unbearable. The Radford film is also, structurally, a film about surveillance. The telescreens are constantly present. The cameras hum. The thought police arrest Winston and Julia in a sequence that runs through their bedroom in real time. The appendix is absent entirely. There have been television adaptations and failed development cycles. The 1954 BBC version, written by Nigel Neal and starring Peter Cushing, generated genuine public outrage. Questions were raised in Parliament about whether the broadcast should be allowed. It remains, in some accounts, the most powerful screen version produced, and it is also a surveillance film, with the rats in the cage and the 2-minute hate doing the dramatic heavy lifting. The recent history of the property mostly consists of producers struggling to figure out how to make a film about the book that says something the existing adaptations have not already said. The reason none of these development projects have entered production is the same reason none of the existing adaptations actually captured the book. Every element of the novel that visual medium can process has been processed, and the cumulative result is a body of screen work that renders Orwell's atmosphere with reasonable fidelity, while leaving the novel's central project undisturbed on the page. And now we move on to the book itself, because the same pattern shows up in every adaptation of every dangerous literary property, not just 1984. If you want to see it play out with Animal Farm, I trace that exact structural compromise in a separate essay. Link is in the description. But let's return to 1984. The opening line is famous. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. The line operates as a temporal disruption. The clocks have been redesigned to run on a 24-hour cycle the readers barely meant to understand, and that one detail establishes the entire premise of the regime. Small, structural changes to the equipment that a person uses to navigate the world. The next 250 pages are a study in cognitive equipment under attack. Winston Smith is a propagandist by trade. His job at the Ministry of Truth involves rewriting old newspaper articles to bring them into alignment with the party's current positions. He uses the memory hole to dispose of the previous versions. He spends his working life producing the linguistic record that will become the historical reality everyone else has to live inside. He is, by occupation, a destroyer of language and a fabricator of the past. His first act of rebellion is to purchase a diary. The whole novel hinges on the act of generating private, unsupervised language. Winston's diary is the first place in the book where words mean what they have always meant, in the order he chooses to place them. The party's eventual response to this rebellion is structurally a response to language, with the physical resistance treated as a downstream concern. The torture sequences in the Ministry of Love are also language operations. O'Brien's project sits one layer below the extraction of information. He is reconstructing Winston's interior monologue. The famous Four Fingers exchange is a language exercise. O'Brien holds up 4 fingers and asks Winston how many he sees. Winston says 4. O'Brien tells him the correct answer is 5, depending on what the party requires. The torture continues until Winston can produce the answer the party requires while genuinely believing it. The pain is the medium. The destination is the rewiring of the relationship between perception and language. Breaking it down, the telescreens are infrastructure, the thought police are enforcement, Big Brother is iconography. The real project is Newspeak, the slow contraction of vocabulary to a point where the thought crime becomes literally impossible, because words required to formulate it have been removed. Syme, Winston's colleague at the Ministry of Truth, says it out loud to him in one of the early chapters. Don't you see that the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible, because there will be no words in which to express it. That's the thesis of the novel, stated by a person who embodies it himself. The party is trying to eliminate the cognitive substrate dissent requires. The appendix at the end of the book makes the program's terms explicit. It is titled The Principles of Newspeak, and it is written in the past tense. The shift in tense is the most important formal move in the entire novel. The appendix describes Newspeak as a project that existed and is now being studied historically. The implication lands without underlying itself. Oceania did not last. The language project failed. That implication is the book's optimism, smuggled into the very apparatus that supposedly explains the regime's mechanics. No screen adaptation has ever rendered the appendix. The thing the book closes on is a thing the films cannot find a way to film. Cinema builds its arguments through what is visible and audible in the frame, and the shot is the basic unit of that construction, which means the medium is structurally oriented towards presence and the observable rather than towards absence in the interior. A telescreen in a wall is a shot. A boot stamping on a human face is a shot. The faces in a crowd at a 2 minutes hate are shots. A vocabulary contracting from 12,000 words to 1,000 is not a shot. The loss of a word is invisible. A person who has lost a word performs no recognizable behavior for the loss. The word simply does not arrive when it is needed, and film has no apparatus for the absence of arrival. The Radford adaptation tried. There are moments, including Winston's face at his diary, and the specific way Hurt holds his mouth when he is trying to formulate something the regime has made unsayable, that move closer to the interior project than most adaptations get. The film pushes those moments to the edges of its running time and lets the police state spectacle carry the middle and the climax. The film the book actually wants is a film about a writer who happens to also be under surveillance, with the writing itself as the central event. Every adaptation has had to substitute a more filmable subject for the actual subject of the novel. If you're drawn to stories that challenge and inspire, subscribe and be part of the conversation. Let's return back to the cultural history of how the wrong reading became the dominant reading. The word Orwellian entered general usage in the late 1950s, became stable shorthand by the 1970s, and by the 2000s, with the post-9/11 surveillance era, the rise of NSA programs, and the consolidation of consumer data collection by the major platforms all converging, was the default critical adjective for any expansion of state or corporate monitoring. And of course, this shorthand was reinforced by the adaptations, even though they did not invent it. A reader who encounters the book without prior framing tends to come away with a more nuanced understanding of what Orwell was warning against. They have spent 10 hours inside Winston's head. They have been walked around the appendix. The viewer who encounters 1984 through the Apple ad, the Radford film, or the cultural osmosis of the surveillance state shorthand walks away with a different book in their head, one where Newspeak appears as a word with no system attached, and Doublethink registers as a clever neologism with no cognitive operation attached. This is of course partially true. The party does run a surveillance state. The reading also misses the sequence of priorities Orwell built into the structure. Surveillance is the support apparatus, but the language itself, that's the central project. The party's interest in knowing what its citizens think sits downstream of its interest in redesigning the equipment those citizens use to think. The cultural dominance of the surveillance reading has produced second-order consequences. Contemporary discussions of digital privacy frequently use Orwellian as a key adjective, and the application is approximate at best. The concern Orwell raised was that the architecture of thought is downstream of the architecture of language, and that an institution able to edit language itself can eventually edit thought itself. The warning the book is actually delivering is both more specific and more difficult to act on. Surveillance can be addressed through encryption and anonymity, while language degradation operates through a slower and more diffuse mechanism that no resistance toolkit has yet developed a clean response to. This is the same calculation that sanitizes every dangerous literary adaptation. I made a similar argument about Lord of the Flies. Golding's book is dangerous precisely because of what it implies about human nature, and every adaptation has diffused it for identical reasons. That video is on the channel if you want to see the patterns again. And now we move on to what the language project actually consisted of, because the diagnostic gets sharper once the technical structure of Newspeak is on the table. The appendix divides the Newspeak vocabulary into 3 categories, and each one is performing a specific cognitive operation on the citizens forced to use it. First, we have vocabulary A. It covers everyday concepts like eating, working, walking, and drinking. The words have been stripped to their barest functional shape, with synonyms removed, connotations removed, and ambiguity engineered out at the level of the word itself. A speaker using the A vocabulary cannot say anything imprecise about ordinary life. The party has decided what imprecision is acceptable, and the words available to that speaker no longer permit anything else. The B vocabulary covers political concepts, and this is where the regime's actual project really lives. The B vocabulary consists almost entirely of compound words that fuse 2 or more concepts into single units the party has approved. Doublethink is the famous example. The vocabulary extends through duckspeak, goodthink, crimethink, and oldspeak. Every one of these is a unit of meaning that bundles a political evaluation into the act of naming. A speaker reaching for the word goodthink performs the evaluation in the act of identifying the thought. A citizen using the B vocabulary cannot think about a political subject without simultaneously delivering the party's verdict on it, because the citizen has no neutral words to think with. The C vocabulary covers scientific and technical concepts. It is highly compartmentalized, with each specialist having access only to the terms relevant to their field. There is no general scientific vocabulary because there is no general scientific orientation the party is willing to permit. The party set a deadline. The final form of Newspeak was scheduled for completion in 2050. 66 years from the events of the novel proper, the language was to be fully replaced and the cognitive equipment of the population to be fully redesigned. The regime had a schedule for completing the thought project, and the schedule was already running. Every concept the party did not want available to its citizens would simply have no word attached to it. Concepts like freedom would survive as words would have been narrowed to mean only the absence of physical restriction, in the sense that Orwell's own appendix uses. A dog free from lice, a field free from weeds. The political sense would be gone. The current moment has made the language reading newly legible. Large language models have surfaced the structure of language as a tunable system, with users watching the same prompts produce different outputs depending on which categories the underlying system has been trained to surface. Social media has compressed political discourse into vocabulary registers dramatically smaller than the registers political discourse used to occupy, with the same 15 or 20 keywords cycling through every conversation, and each one carrying implicit evaluations bundled into the act of using them. This is B vocabulary in operation. Disinformation infrastructure has demonstrated that a sustained campaign of language manipulation could shift the framings a population uses, even when the underlying facts remain accessible. This applies to everyone, left and right. The accessibility of facts is the tool the surveillance reading of 1984 trusts as a protection against authoritarian control. The language reading of the same novel predicted that the accessibility of facts would not be sufficient on its own, because facts have to be processed through language, and a sufficiently degraded language can absorb facts without rendering them meaningful. Orwell's warning has, over the last decade, gradually slid from the prophetic into the descriptive. The screen tradition that has formed around the novel has not delivered the corrective the moment requires. The adaptations focus on the dimensions of the book the visual medium can render, leaving the dimensions that carry the language warning outside their range. A culture trained by the screen versions to scan for surveillance overreach is unequipped to recognize the slower, more diffuse degradation Orwell actually warned about. The shorthand has, in a strange, recursive way, become its own version of the linguistic limitation the book describes. What the book finally hands the reader is the image of a writer at a desk, the act of composition as a primary form of resistance, while the culture's received version is settled on the image of Big Brother on the screen, the regime's gaze rather than its grammar as the organizing symbol of the threat. The gap between those two artifacts is the gap between what Orwell wrote and what institutions interpreting him for the general public have been able to deliver. The book holds on to a particular kind of optimism. Newspeak and Oceania failed. The appendix is the proof, smuggled into the back of the volume in a register no diegetic character would have produced. Somewhere outside the world of the novel, language was reclaimed, the regime's central project broke down, and a future in which Newspeak is discussed in past tense became the future the novel actually describes. The culture has absorbed the surveillance and lost the optimism. The screen versions have given audiences a regime that watches them, but the book gave us something more. It gave readers a regime that lasted only as long as it could control the words. The film that returns the optimism to the screen still has not been made. Until it is, every adaptation will continue to deliver a version of Orwell that is structurally smaller than the version he wrote. The work of reading him correctly has stayed where it always has. Inside the book, the adaptations keep trying to translate without ever quite finding the language to do it. The adaptations have given us 70 years of warning about surveillance. Orwell was writing a different warning, though. The receipts on that warning come due in the present, in the vocabulary registers we are actively losing as the words for things we used to be able to name continue to drop out of common use. Thanks for watching, and stay copacetic.